It's a great pleasure to be here today and to be part of the signature event at the Haskayne School of Business, the 4th annual PETRONAS International Energy Speaker Series. Today, we're talking about Canada's successful path to 2050. The imperative to shift to a net zero world is certainly upon us. And the path to achieving that goal lies in several parts: science, innovation, entrepreneurship, and curiosity. The University of Calgary is playing a role in this journey through a variety of disciplines: science, engineering, business, public policy. There is no such thing as a siloed solution, which means the private sector is an equal player. Whether through the efforts at individual companies, associations, including CRIN and COSIA, and accelerator programs such as Creative Destruction Labs, Rockies, there are a number of different threads coming together to change the way our barrels are extracted. One thing is certain: the environmental footprint of a barrel today, as a result of the combined efforts of the private and public sectors and the academic world, is very different than the barrel that was on the table when the Keystone XL pipeline was first proposed. And it's through these ongoing collaborative efforts that will help us to achieve the net zero goals in 2050. Before we proceed with this engaging topic, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Dakota, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. This series brings amazing speakers to share energy insights with a global perspective. Our previous speakers have included Maria van der Hoeven, former executive director of the International Energy Agency, who spoke in 2019 and who's here with us today; Harry Chilingirian, global head of commodity market strategy and senior oil market strategist at BNP Paribas, who was with us in 2018. And in 2017, Ernest Moniz, the 13th US Secretary of Energy, was the featured speaker. I would like to extend a big thank you to the Haskayne School of Business and to PETRONAS Canada for establishing this speaker series to bring us a perspective into what's happening globally on the energy front. Today, we tackle a topic that is top of mind for business and government. We have seen our federal government table net zero targets. The new US administration is moving in the same direction, and this week, Larry Fink of BlackRock issued his annual letter explicitly saying that companies his firm invests in will have to show a plan to achieve net zero by 2050. I would like to acknowledge the special guests that are joining us online today: members of the University of Calgary's Board of Governors, Senate, and Executive Leadership Team, generous supporters, alumni, and friends, and a special thank you to our friends at PETRONAS Canada and PETRONAS Global, who have generously supported this series. We are price takers in the global energy market, which is why we need to understand the macro trends and learn of how other jurisdictions are responding to the current environment. As Chancellor, not only do I have the opportunity to interact with future leaders of Canada's business community emerging from the Haskayne School of Business, I get to see the exciting innovations coming from our esteemed researchers at the University of Calgary. We aspire to be Canada's most entrepreneurial university in our country's most enterprising city. The University of Calgary and our entrepreneurial ecosystem, supported by faculty and through centers such as the Hunter Hub for Entrepreneurial Thinking, Innovate Calgary, and CDL Rockies, generates $16.5 billion in economic activity in the city. This is proof that igniting innovation, breaking down silos, and building synergistic partnerships shows entrepreneurial thinking can not only be taught, but it yields measurable results. Again, thank you to PETRONAS Canada for supporting this valuable speaker series. Bringing a global energy perspective to Calgary is important. Our oil and natural gas doesn't just compete with the US, it competes with the world. Thank you again for being here today. Please take the opportunity to submit questions using the Q&A function. And now I would like to invite Mark Fitzgerald, President and CEO at PETRONAS Canada, to share a few words.
Great. Thank you very much, Chancellor Edlin, and I certainly appreciate your land acknowledgement for those of us participating from Calgary. I would also like to acknowledge that PETRONAS's operations in Canada are located in the traditional territory, of the Treaty 8 Nations, the land of the Denetah and the Cree. As we all know, and this goes without saying, 2020 was an extremely challenging year for all of us. We were faced with a pandemic, low and volatile commodity prices, and economic uncertainty. However, as with all challenges, adversity triggers innovation and opportunity. For us, 2021 brings optimism to rebuild our economy and, to quote Minister O'Regan, build back better. I'm really excited about the role Canadian energy has to play, both within Canada as a driver of our economic recovery, but for Canada on the global stage, as a leader in the supply of energy that meets the high standards expected of us by society. We have an opportunity to continue our global leadership in technology and innovation in emissions reductions. We have an opportunity to balance economic growth with environmental sustainability through initiatives such as PETRONAS's net zero aspirations. We have an opportunity to further reconciliation with Indigenous economic participation, and I believe we have an opportunity to export a Canadian product that is the result of robust regulatory and environmental oversight. All of this is reflected in how our Canadian energy products are developed. This is not just an opportunity, but a responsibility, and one that we at PETRONAS are passionate about, to build a sustainable and a prosperous world for future generations. The series today is timely, and it allows us for consideration of the path forward for Canada and our important role in the global energy context. While we consider the opportunities that our country and our industry have before us, we must be cognizant of and focused on the significant competitiveness and perception challenges that we have in front of us. The series and the discussions that we'll hear today allow us to discuss those challenges and jointly look for solutions and a path forward. You will remember our first panel member, Maria van der Hoeven, from her time with us in 2019, when we discussed the state of international LNG markets and Canada's potential. Ms. van der Hoeven is the former executive director of the International Energy Agency, and during her tenure at the IEA, she led the agency through a time of significant change, which ultimately transformed its mandate. As a member of the Global Commission on Economy and Climate, she has initiated discussions between policymakers and industry representatives on the impact of climate change on energy security. Ms. van der Hoeven is joining us from the Netherlands, and we thank you both for staying up in the evening and for graciously accepting our opportunity to visit with us again. Thank you. Next, we have the Honorable Seamus O'Regan, Canada's Minister of Natural Resources. He was first elected to Parliament in 2015. Minister O'Regan is a proud Canadian and proud Newfoundlander, which, as he likes to point out and remind us, is also dependent on the oil and gas industry. I would also like to acknowledge and thank Minister O'Regan for his advocacy and support for the energy sector, and specifically for his recent work on the hydrogen strategy for Canada, announced in December. This hydrogen strategy will further support the positioning of Canada as a global energy leader on the path to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. I was very glad also that the hydrogen strategy recognizes the valuable role of the natural gas sector in driving hydrogen development in Canada. Finally, also joining us today from many time zones away in Malaysia, quite frankly, I believe in the middle of the night, is the President and Group CEO of PETRONAS, Tengku Taufiq. Taufiq was appointed President and Group CEO of PETRONAS in July of last year, and prior to that, he served as PETRONAS's Chief Financial Officer. Taufiq leads PETRONAS, an international company headquartered in Malaysia with more than 47,000 employees around the globe, operating in 90 countries. Given the scope of these global operations, which includes the total value chain from upstream, midstream, downstream, and marketing, Taufiq has a keen interest in energy development, addressing climate change, and leading PETRONAS towards a sustainable energy future for generations to come. In November, Taufiq announced PETRONAS's commitment to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, delivering clean energy and low carbon solutions to people globally. Under his leadership, PETRONAS will be a global energy leader positioned to meet global energy requirements the right way for generations to come. And finally, let me introduce today's moderator, Jackie Forrest, Executive Director of ARC Energy Research Institute, actively monitors emerging strategic trends related to industry. Ms. Forrest is an author and sought-after public speaker with nearly 25 years of experience in the energy industry. She is the host of the popular Arc Energy Ideas podcast, which is a weekly show that explains the latest trends and news in Canadian energy and beyond. If you haven't listened to it, I highly encourage you to listen in. Ms. Forrest was a recipient of the 2018 Schulich School of Engineering, Environment and Sustainability Alumni Award, recognizing her contribution to a significant body of knowledge that has helped to increase the understanding of the connection between energy and the environment. With that, welcome to all of our panel members. Jackie, we're in good hands with you. Pass it over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mark. And thanks for a plug for the podcast, and welcome everyone. It's great to see everyone here. Well, we don't have a lot of time, so I want to get right into it. But before we do that, we have hundreds of people on this webinar today, and we want to hear what they think about net zero to just give a framework in terms of where our audience sits. So could we put up the polling question, please? Okay, so the question is, what is your confidence that the leading economies, including Canada, will aggressively move towards net zero? So we'll just give everyone a little bit of time here. And okay, I think just wait for us to wrap this up. Okay, so I hope you can see the results. I can. 44% say high, 32% say low, and there's a bunch of people in the middle. So, our goal, panelists, is maybe to convince these folks that there is a path forward here to get to net zero. I know some of you have some pretty strong opinions. So let's get going with the panel. Maria, if I may call you Maria, let's get started with, the net zero. Despite the uncertainty with COVID, 2020 seems to be the year of net zero. We've got governments like the Canadian government legislating net zero, companies around the world, including PETRONAS, committing to net zero. Maria, if I asked you this year, do you have conviction that the world is really headed in this way? Which way would you vote on that poll? And has your view changed since before COVID?
Well, Jackie, there's no doubt the world is heading towards a net zero 2050, and fossils will be part of that, clean fossils. And we see that today's economy is gradually evolving into a more sustainable and circular economy. And some think there is no place in this new world for existing oil and gas companies. But this would deny that oil and gas companies have a lot to offer in this energy transition, and they are capable to cope with substantial change. And an ideological debate on how to ban all sources of fossil energy doesn't lead to anything. Decarbonization is not equivalent to defossilization. So coming back to your question, no, my view has not changed. We are heading to net zero in 2050. And in many regions in the world, I observe an important acceleration. And yes, we are still in the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic, and governments increase their role in the economy, be it fairly directly through economic stimulus policies or more indirectly through central banks and their intervention in financial and capital markets. And what I can see is that COVID-19 acts as a catalyst in many respects, so also in the energy transition, not least because of the recovery investment agenda different governments are contemplating on. And yes, a post-COVID economy, post-COVID-19 economy will be a more sustainable economy, with strong emphasis on further digitalization, on resilience. And public listed companies will be asked more and more about their purpose and what their contribution is to sustainable society with a growing population, growing energy, specifically power demand. And pace and pathways will differ, but the trend and direction, it's clear. So listed companies like oil and gas companies have to be sure that the energy sector's objectives are aligned sufficiently with the public agenda.
All right, and we're seeing a lot of public support, public money going into the net zero, and that's a good time to welcome Minister O'Regan to the conversation. Good to see you again. Canada, as we all know, has tabled the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act in November, and you've also put out some pretty aggressive policy that will reduce our GHG, like the $170 carbon tax and the clean fuel standard. So, tell us a bit more about how Canada is going to move in this direction.
I think as a government, we've been fairly straightforward about this. I looked at the answers and I wonder what the answers would have been perhaps a week ago. before President Biden was inaugurated. It is a bit of a game changer, the commitment that we have seen from his administration on net zero and on climate and energy. We were deeply disappointed by the KXL decision. Let me just say that right straight up. He had made that commitment. I think it was back in May, and we had started. And I think, Jackie, I've been here before and talked to you about how closely we have worked with the Alberta government on this. We worked on the ground in Washington. James Bershad, who's the former member of Parliament, but the Alberta's Washington special representative, myself, and Minister Savage spoke weekly on tactics on the ground, and to make our case, we did not get that opportunity. And first and foremost, I think of 1,000 people who are out of work as a result. The reason I raise them too is looking forward, we need them. I mean, I'm here in Newfoundland and Labrador, as was pointed out, I think by Mark, that the other oil-producing jurisdiction in this country, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and ourselves, and we're used to losing people here in this province. I don't like losing people. These are talented people in our energy sector. The reason why I say we are going to meet net zero, and I'm very positive about this, is because we managed to find a way to get oil out of sand. That is a remarkable thing, and create the 4th biggest producer of oil in the world. That requires ingenuity and determination and a lot of hard work. And here in Newfoundland's offshore, the head of ExxonMobil Canada, which is headquartered here in St. John's, has told me that there is no more hazardous environment that ExxonMobil operates in the world than Newfoundland's offshore. Fishermen could have told you that for many generations going back. It's tough. But that's the ingenuity, and these are the people that we have. And that's why, like the Orphan and an Active Well program that we started, $1.7 billion for that, early last year at the outset of the pandemic, was to retain a lot of talented people, keep them working, a lot of expertise and experience that we are going to need as we lower emissions. As Maria pointed out, this is happening. I'm quite, yesterday Standard & Poor's came out and warned 13 oil and gas companies, including some of the world's biggest, that it may downgrade them within weeks because of increasing competition from renewables. So, what Maria pointed to earlier about, where you fit on the political spectrum on this, the market is moving. It is moving now.
Yes.
And it is happening before our eyes. And I think what you were seeing from Standard & Poor's, now that you've got, a U.S. government that is aggressive about combating climate change, watch the world move. It is going to move. And the good news is, I think that we're well equipped to be on top of it. I mean, first of all, we are now going to be dealing with an administration that, while it may be aggressive, is somewhat predictable. In other words, we're not going to, and this goes for any jurisdiction, including in Maria's country or in Tenku's country. We are no longer going to have energy policy by tweet. That's a refreshing change of pace. We will now have a predictable but aggressive and ambitious government to deal with, but at least we know that we'll be dealing with them at the table. And because we got a lot of work to do. I'll leave it there because I know I want to leave time for questions, but hopefully that diatribe answered your question.
Well, and thank you for addressing the Keystone XL cancellation. I know a lot of people on the call here, a lot of the audience is quite disappointed and questioning where we go from here, and how net zero could maybe. Do you think if we'd moved more aggressively on some of these policies, that building infrastructure would be easier if we move more aggressively towards net zero?
I mean, you're hearing this from a politician, but politics is politics sometimes. The fact is, I'm very proud of TC Energy and the way that they moved on this project. The Prime Minister said it himself, a meeting that we attended with Premier Kenny before Christmas. The KXL pipeline of 2020, 2021, very different than the KXL pipeline of 2015. They had done 3 remarkable things, I think. They had moved to make sure that it was union work on both sides of the border. They were working hand in glove and negotiating equity positions for Native Americans on their side of the border and on with First Nations on our side of the border, First Nations and Métis communities. And then they had, they were going to attain, they had a plan to attain operational net zero for a pipeline by 2023. They were moving and are moving in the right direction. And it is, I was proud to support and champion that project. And that's the direction that we have to move in. That oil's moving. So let's make sure that it moves responsibly. We have a lot on the table with the Americans. I'm of the mind that the windshield is bigger than the rearview mirror. And not only are our priorities more aligned with this administration than the previous administration, but, and I've said this to Minister Savage and to Minister Eyre in Saskatchewan, I believe that the governments of Alberta and Saskatchewan, their priorities are more aligned with this administration and their commitments to lowering emissions. So I am hopeful. I am hopeful, but I'll admit it's on KXL is a disappointing start, but I think there's a lot more here that we agree on than we disagree. Okay, well, let's bring Tawfik into the conversation. And I agree, it's great. I think there'll be areas of collaboration with the US government and Canada. Tawfik is joining us. It's very early in the morning right now. It's joining us from Malaysia. So thank you for getting up super early. Let's talk about net zero. Your company made a commitment in November of 2020. Why did you do that?
Well, first off, a good day to Minister Reagan, and pleasure to make your acquaintance, Maria. Unfortunately, it's online, new norms. Let's dive straight into the question. Why I did it, it's not to keep up with the Joneses. It's not because it's trendy. It's not because Shell and Total have done it, or whether BP has pushed the envelope on the subject. I think Mark's introduction earlier on, I think, did allude to the fact that I was previously the chief bean counter for the company before I assumed this role. Well, it's assuming the role at a point where probably the roller coaster ride is going to get really, really interesting. We had, and I'm speaking to both people in policy making and people who are academia, part of the academia here. Let's deal with the reality. When we come into the space of being an oil and gas player, the subject of net zero was always imminent until about 2 years ago. But when I assumed the role, at that point, all the shifts that Minister Reagan had pointed to had become not just vaguely appearing around the horizon. It was right in your face. There were a number of banks, particularly from Europe, who told us, if you don't spell out your your emissions ambitions, we can't subscribe to you. And entering the capital markets was not going to be possible, particularly for longer papers, unless we had documented, committed, and shown clear evidence that we were going to go down the path of reducing emissions, to become a cleaner and more responsible player. In the US, while not being so evangelical, I think, however, I think the behavior of BlackRock of late has turned that story a bit. When we went to the market, the American institutions forced us to be more granular. Previously, it was just a general direction. It was a disclose versus explain commitment. But today, they're asking for when you are going to do things, what kind of resources you're going to set aside for it. And these parts of the narrative are no longer going to be luxury. They're not a nice to have. This has to be woven into how you operate, your business plans, how you behave, particularly as you move across jurisdictions. The only ones who accommodated the fuller and more aggressive ambitions were potentially the ones from Taiwan and Japan. Banks in Taiwan and Japan had a longer term view, particularly with our DNA being a national oil company. They knew we had to serve a very energy hungry Asia. So a little bit more relaxed about these things, but now firmly on the checklist, wanting to understand, if we're going to issue you 10 to 30 year paper, hey, you've got to tell me at least you have plans and there's some commitment to support policies. Mm-hmm. Fast forward, entering 2020, I think 2020 you've described as a year of net zero. Which countries haven't committed to it? I think Prime Minister Trudeau has been very clear in his ambitions. We've had Japan's Suga-san coming on board and indicating, hey, we can't be out of this ride. That energy mix that contains a lot more coal and nuclear, that's got to go. So that's really going to have a dent on the energy mix in Japan, one of our core markets, by 2050. Xi Jinping, I had the privilege of attending his address to the World Conference, World Economic Forum Conference earlier, 2060. Before that, preceded by many blue sky policies adopted by all the major cities in Asia. So even in energy-hungry Asia, where, as a fact, a bulk of the 600 or 700 million people who still don't have regular access to electricity, the policymakers are shifting towards having cleaner, more responsible sources of energy. So as an energy player, and notice I'm describing Petronas now as an energy player, not an oil and gas player, we have little choice but to embrace it. I am very encouraged by Minister Reagan's reading, and I think what Maria has mentioned as well. In all the dialogues and conversations we've had with our peers, with our counterparts, with our financiers or our customers, there is an acknowledgement, and I have to borrow upon Maria's former colleagues' projections here. In any scenario, even in IEA's most aggressive sustainable development scenarios, we still see oil and gas forming slightly under half of the energy mix 20 to 30 years out. What will change is that the slice of the donut or the pie representing renewables will probably take a real quantum shift. There's going to be from 10% probably up to a quarter of the energy mix in 2040 being addressed by renewables. And that's no surprise at all. I think the cost of power generation from solar and wind have dropped off. It's now truly competitive even with coal in a number of jurisdictions. So this mix, I think, just to borrow Minister Reagan's earlier description, the market's changing. The policymakers are really aggressively shifting. The customers we're dealing with, and I'm speaking to a university crowd here, there's a woke generation that will not accept entities which only play for profit. It has to be profit with purpose. So all of these have converged. And I think, although it seems that everyone within the oil and gas space is jumping on the net zero bandwagon just to be trendy or just to respond, we've actually realized the trajectory was going in that direction anyway. It has just been really, the focus is just sharpened in 2020. So COVID's brought that to bear. And I think here we are. And the industry has to respond.
So you're investing in Canada with being part of the LNG Canada project, one of the partners, and the upstream side as well. Minister Regan and the federal government put out some pretty serious things like $170 carbon tax and a clean fuel standard. How does that make you feel about your investment here in Canada?
I had the privilege of introducing Prime Minister Trudeau at the APEC Council, and I think I don't want to misquote him, so just let me refer to some of my notes here. He said, and I do quote, right? We want to ensure that Canadians and Canadian businesses have access to dynamic markets with energy demand, and there is a huge potential for Canada to be part of this very important equation to address the need for shared prosperity. Working together, and he's saying as a potential major supplier, resolving the energy equation for the future, working together just makes good sense. At that juncture, I think Petronas, as a key investor, with a large commitment in LNG Canada, as well as Petronas Canada, we are really encouraged by this kind of appetite for Canada to play an important part in the equation. His view, and I quote, was that Canada forms a gateway to the Pacific, and he views that these nodes are hubs to respond to the energy demand of the future. And I think his commitment, Canada's commitment to the Trans-Pacific Partnership was very early and very vocal. And I think that the plus here is that there is a realization that players such as Petronas just have to step up. Remember, it's a price of emissions, so we'll have to be very sharp around controlling our emissions. Petronas has already at group level committed to a 49.5 million tons of CO2 per annum target. It's declared. From where we are, we're going to get there by 2024. But the challenge put forth, and it naturally, carbon tax it's a punitive measure to create aversion. So we're going to have to respond technologically. I think what Mr. Reagan has outlined, the entire industry has just got to clean its act up. But in doing so, we also need to balance that there are jobs. There are jobs at risk. I think if I have my stats right, there's about 160, 170,000 jobs in Canada alone within the space. I think within BC, I think we're anywhere between 55 to 60,000 jobs. We need to make sure the equation deals with both ends of the challenge, which is, yes, you have to be clean, but you've got to make sure you're competitive from a cost to serve perspective. If you believe in a long-term scenario that you're having to address these core needs in Asia, in the Pacific, at about $7 to $8 per million British thermal units, MMBTU, you're going to need to make sure these blocks make sense. Anything from logistics, production upstream. I keep Mark up at night as he is making me stay up at night tonight to come in and say, what's the part of the solution? These blocks, to get it to the client, there's the extraction, there's the liquefaction, there's the transport, there's the shipping. All of these are enabled by technology. We've got to respond to them, to the challenges posed by net zero. And of course, the carbon tax is enough of a punitive aversion measure. I think we do know why he's done this. We accept it, but there is that balance to be struck. I think that's and we're always going to consult, work with local government, work with our counterparts. Shell's with us in LNG Canada. We're proud to say that LNG Canada, upon its operations, upon its commencement of operations, will likely be the cleanest LNG producer within our portfolio. And that's what we need to emulate more and more of.
Yeah.
Mr. Regan, do you want to respond to any of those comments?
Well, first of all, great way to end it. That's exactly how we feel. I'm very proud of the project. I'll just address, the price on pollution. Just about any economist that I'm aware of agrees that this is the way to go. Sustainable change only really happens if the market responds. I mean, it's the market that's moving right now. Mm-hmm. For those people that are, interested in lowering emissions, you will find no more effective instrument, I think, than the market. And if you don't embrace that, then the alternative is, I don't know. I mean, government would have to find some convoluted regulatory regime, that may not fit. I think that we have to give the market the incentive to respond. And that is the most efficient way to go about it. If you agree that we have to lower emissions and that's no longer just, a political imperative, or I would argue the case in climate change, a moral imperative or an existential imperative. But now that it is increasingly, with news on Standard & Poor's and last year on BlackRock and others and banks, and they continue to accumulate, it is a financial imperative. And I remember a year ago, pre-pandemic, being in Calgary with Minister Savage and a number of other players in the oil sands, and having just given a speech at Globe, the Clean Tech Conference in Vancouver, and saying that there was no way we would reach net zero without Alberta. There was no way we would reach net zero without the oil and gas industry in this country. And on the flip side, we will not have a prosperous energy sector, oil and gas sector in this country without net zero. I am not cynical about net zero in that it became very clear to me upon taking this position that the way the markets were moving and the way investors were going, they were not, always hearing the story about how Canadian oil and gas, first of all, its ESG rating, which is the highest in the world. BMO founded that, but it was also affirmed by the World Bank and by Yale University. But the problem was investors were just looking and saying, so in my portfolio, what am I doing about climate change? Well, I'm getting out of Canadian oil and gas. That is an extremely dangerous place for our country to be in.
Right.
And increasingly what we saw was that investors were looking to net zero as kind of the grade, as the marker, right. The other side of the ledger that convinced people that you were taking action. Net zero, once again, allows governments, allows societies, allows companies to figure out how to get there. I've called it a moonshot, and I think it had been misinterpreted when I said moonshot as being kind of airy-fairy, or let's throw everything against the wall and see what sticks. Not so. When I say moonshot, I mean it, as it was intended by President Kennedy back in the day, back in, I think, 1960, and 9 years later, they got on the moon. It is a singular goal, right? We want to get to the moon. And what that did was it just enabled and emboldened the entire country, the United States of America, to get a man on the moon. And they did.
Right.
And that is what we got to do with net zero. It is a moonshot in that it is singular in its purpose, and we are determined to get there. Not sure how we're going to get there yet, but we have to allow companies and the market to find that way. The commitment is extremely important, though.
Yeah. And I think a couple of points, Taoufik, you talked about need for capital, and that enabled you to access more capital. And also to make you feel better, Taoufik, about Canada, we do have a large emitters program. So you only play at the margin, which is also really beneficial as we have to compete. Let's switch the topic to hydrogen and LNG and gas. Under the scenarios for the IEA Sustainable Development Scenario, gas is not expected to grow very much in the future. And if you go further into some of the more aggressive net zero scenarios, it would actually decline the use of natural gas. But there is also big expectations that hydrogen will grow and replace the use of natural gas. So Maria, could you just give us the European perspective? If 2020 was the year of net zero pledges and hydrogen, it turns out, what is Europe doing around hydrogen? My understanding is they're spending hundreds of billions of euros, or pledging that at least, to try to grow their use of hydrogen.
Well, I think you're right in your question. The European Union will put a lot of money when it comes to hydrogen, but it's not only the European Union as such, but also a number of countries having developing their plans. The Netherlands, for instance, France, Germany, and others as well. And the point is that it is looked upon as the missing link in the energy transition. Why? Because it could contribute to the seasonal storage of large volumes of intermittent renewables. It could serve as a clean fuel in the transport sector. It could help the industrial sector to reduce their carbon footprint using hydrogen as feedstock and energy carrier. Just in short, it is a future supplement to the increased role of clean energy in the economy. But hydrogen is hydrogen, and all these colors, black, blue, gray, green, etc., they have nothing to do with hydrogen. They have to do with the point of origin, and in doing so, they add an emotional aspect. Now, some technologies are favored over others, and this is not conducive to the development of a national, regional, or even global hydrogen market. So we should ensure that its production does not contribute to climate change, and hence the importance of a worldwide classification and certification of hydrogen combined with a system for measurements, monitoring, verification, and control. And this can ensure trust and confidence by consumers in their suppliers. And I know, for instance, that Canada, like many other countries, is a member to the IPHE. They are working on this issue. Now, the EU has that strong focus on net zero in 2050. And solar and wind are, for us, the new domestically available energy sources. But when we are talking about hydrogen, it's not only about speeding up the technology learning curve, it's also developing a new industry, developing new jobs. So it's not just something that goes between now and 2030, it goes further down the road. And this new hydrogen policy encourages companies to invest in what is frequently called, as I mentioned, this missing link in the whole transition. And yes, maybe it is a bit exaggerated, but the new focus, the EU focus on green hydrogen and private companies' interest in it demonstrates how fast things are changing. So let me mention you just a few examples out of many. When you go to France, there you have Engie and Total partnering to develop the largest hydrogen production site in Europe. In the UK, part of Europe, although no longer of the EU, where Indian energy company Essar is planning to build the UK's biggest low-carbon energy production hub, and Canada's SNC-Lavalin is involved there too. Germany, Linde to build, own and operate the world's largest PM electrolyzer plant at the Luna chemical complex. And in my own country, the Netherlands, where public and private actors in the northern provinces plan to develop a hydrogen valley to realize a prominent Dutch hydrogen industry, and located on top of the base of the Dutch gas pipeline infrastructure, which serves consumers across Europe. So this provides new economic perspectives to this region. And furthermore, there are plans for a large hydrogen plant based on natural gas and waste gases with CCS in the Rotterdam Industrial Complex. So just a few examples, and it's not only the EU with its money, with lots of money, there's an enormous amount of money, but it's also plans of the different countries to be on to this and to work on it, also from a national perspective.
Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left. I have a quick question for the Minister and one for Tawfik. So, Minister, you put out the Canadian hydrogen strategy, and it shows a lot of opportunity, I think, for Canada. It's very exciting, but we don't have it funding anything close to what's going on in Europe. Do you anticipate that there's going to be more funding to create that infrastructure that Maria was talking about, that's needed to get this going?
We are definitely open to talking about all that. That's for sure. I mean, where we can incent private investment, surely we want to do that because we think there's major potential for money to be made, as well as for us to find a very low emitting source of energy, and we're doing it. I mean, Mayor Nachu, when we announced it in December of last year, a month ago, she said, we know we can do this because we're already doing it. Proton Energy outside of Calgary is already finding ways to produce hydrogen from oil and gas wells. And Alberta produces, I think, 5,000 tons of hydrogen a day. When we came up with the national strategy, we very much had in mind, a regionally specific approach. I mean, the way that, when we look at Alberta, you got 31 trillion cubic feet of conventional natural gas reserves that could be converted into hydrogen. You've got a significant price advantage coming from Alberta. The way that we're looking at it, we think, we expect blue hydrogen from Alberta with sequestration to be about $1.35 a kilogram. That's pretty good because we expect the average global price for blue hydrogen to be anywhere between $4 and $5 a kilogram. You look at Quebec, obviously, it's different there because, you've got massive amount of hydroelectricity there. So, the potential for green hydrogen is quite high. We also know that green is more expensive, at least at the outset, but we see that, that price point going down considerably. And when we look at the European Union, Maria is quite right. I mean, not only are you looking at significant investments, but you are also looking at planning. And when we look at the European Union, we see, not only a potential customer for Canadian hydrogen, but also a competitor and in a friendly way, an inspiration. The way that the European Union moved very quickly in the late spring in its plans on hydrogen certainly moved things here in this country, no question about it. And I expect that it will also move the United States to move very quickly in this direction as well.
Okay, good. And I encourage everyone to look at that strategy. It's really good background on all the opportunities across Canada. Also, Tawfik, all this talk about hydrogen, and you're investing a lot. You're a major supplier of LNG, a growing supplier of LNG. Does that make you concerned about the future for natural gas?
We have, for the longest time, been an advocate of natural gas being a transition fuel. It's the cleanest of the hydrocarbons. And maybe if I just zoom in on what Canada has got to offer to the world, and I think just want to latch on to the earlier remarks that Prime Minister Trudeau referred to. Our estimates pretty much, I think, bear testimony to the belief that if you've got, as a country, about 1,300 trillion cubic feet, and just by simple math, if each TCF, trillion cubic feet, is about 1 million tons of LNG, you're looking at a country that's capable, even if we develop 50% of it, to answer pretty much the entire world's demand, not too far out. You can be clean, you can be competitive. From the perspective of PETRONAS, we look at natural gas naturally accompanying a renewables transition. It deals with intermittency. The large parts of the globe, which I referred to earlier, still having challenges in having access to regular electricity. I think the red line's drawn at about 1,000 kilowatt hours per annum. If you're going to answer that challenge for the world that is growing in affluence, more urbanization, more electrification, I believe that natural gas will still remain part of the solution for a good while yet. That being said, as a business, I've got to make sure I'm positioned to respond to an eventual shift to possibly hydrogen. We've set up special purpose vehicles. There's studies at home with regards to how we can make the logistics work. I think what Minister Reagan referred to earlier, a number of very, very competitive places to produce hydrogen. The challenge is within the logistics. You do not want to be moving a lot of metal around, and you're pretty much negating the clean effects of hydrogen as an efficient fuel carrier by involving yourself in a lot of scope 3, by involving movement, which then relies on conventional fuel. So all of this is part of the equation. The magic line, and we're talking to a lot of people within this space. I think the buyers are saying the magic line is about $2 per kilo. If the numbers that Minister Reagan are citing can be worked on, and we can get to a really competitive price point out of Canada, the prospects are immense. But we believe it's both natural gas and eventually a shift to both natural gas and renewables, a revolution, so to speak.
Just to briefly add to it, you're absolutely right. There is no panacea. It is going to require a mix of a lot of different things. And Canada is, there is no democracy in the world that has the bounty of resources that we have, that has the number of levers that we do have. And that is a huge part of our national advantage, is that we have so much before us. It's always great to see somebody from outside the country, though, reaffirm that for us, because I think in Canada, we give ourselves such a hard time, but we are very, very well positioned to take on these challenges.
All right, so we can supply LNG today, and in the future, hopefully hydrogen to Asia and Europe. That would be a great vision.
Well, Jackie, that's the point. Canada is positioned perfectly because you have really access to two markets, being positioned in between two oceans.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's enormous. That is an enormous point in your favor. But it will only work if you also have the opportunity, or take the opportunity to clean up your whole production chain. And that means using CCS, that's true, but also seeing to it that you put an end to methane venting and flaring and things like that, because that is what people expect from you, that you produce clean products that they can really take from you, so that they can be proud that you can supply them with.
Right. Well, and to
Maria's
do that, you
point
need the
too,
price
Jackie,
signals.
I'm a lot closer to her than I am to you.
Yeah, that's true.
Here in Newfoundland, we are in the middle of the Atlantic.
Yeah.
And so, I think it would be, Maria, about a 4.5 hour flight for me to get to you, and perhaps about a 6.5 hour flight to Calgary if there was a direct.
Right.
It's not so far as that.
Not at all.
All right, we've got a bit more time here, about a few minutes each, for you to provide some key takeaways based on this discussion as we charter a path to Canada's successful path, hopefully, to net zero 2050. Just some closing remarks from each of you. We'll start with Taufik.
Yeah, I think I'll just continue the thread of the last conversation. Let's look at gas, LNG, and the pathway to a real low carbon future. Science tells us that if you resort to one, it won't be the answer. But there is no one definitive path. The key here is for policymakers, investors such as us, and capital markets to accord each other the space and time to maneuver, but that space and time must be agreed here. And we do need some degree of, as an investor, you do need a degree of regulatory consistency, fiscal stability to ensure this happens. If you recall your earlier remarks around capital being available, last year alone, green bonds, they broke previous year records. I think green bonds went north of, it approached $250 billion. I think 240 billion of green bonds were issued. We need some form of transition financing from the markets, but insofar as Canada and the promise that Canada offers, I can't be bullish enough. Today, it's an investment hypothesis. We've put our capital where our mouth is, and LNG Canada is going to be our evacuation point, but we need more. And I think if there's one thing, since there's a policymaker, I'm in the presence of a policymaker, I do hope actions allow Canada's molecules to reach the points of demand within a right window. There is a risk that the further out we go, some of these molecules will get stranded by sheer unavailability or increasing scarcity of capital, or consumers shifting in such a big way that LNG doesn't become palatable for them, even as they address policy shifts. And that's the only thing that to add some urgency to it.
Well, and if you look at those sustainable development scenarios, there's not a ton of growth for natural gas globally.
Yeah, indeed.
So there is kind of more limited market and opportunity than there would have been maybe if you thought 5 years ago that we weren't going to net zero.
Indeed.
Okay. Next, let's hear from Maria.
Well, first of all, everybody has to accept that there are more pathways to arrive at the wished outcome. So you shouldn't get stuck in an ideological discussion about fossils. It is all about tackling greenhouse gas emissions and transition, and you will need a discussion about how to keep parts of the present energy landscape to realize that transition. My second remark is about everybody has to keep a close eye on new business approaches like market conversion of gas into hydrogen, and of course taking responsibility for carbon at the same time. And my third remark is about it's very, very important that that a country like Canada remains at the forefront of technological and regulatory innovation. Much has been done in the past, and it's not only in the conventional, but also in unconventional oil and gas production and CCS, and that's crucial. But it might not be enough. So you have to strengthen Canadian leadership in clean energy technologies and innovation. And that has to do with strong, stable, higher, and maybe longer term federal and provincial funding, but also see to it that you have the right regulation in place. I think it's very important that countries like Canada, being an important supplier to the world, when it comes down to gas, realizes that there's more to do than just doing business as usual, because business as usual is not possible anymore. That is gone, and it has nothing to do with COVID-19, but it has really to do with the changes that we have seen in the world, societal changes, policy changes, but also changes in how people think about environment and about ESG. And I think this is something that should be realized by everybody.
Great. Thank you very much. And finally, Minister O'Regan.
I always say that our common mission is threefold. Net zero by 2050. We have, secondly, to have an economy that continues to prosper and grow. And thirdly, and this is extremely important, no one can be left behind. Yeah. And by that, to Maria's point, we're talking about industries, I'm talking about jurisdictions, I'm talking about regions, for instance, in our country, Jackie, whether it be Alberta or Newfoundland and Labrador, or workers. We cannot leave people behind. 2 days ago, the International Energy Agency, Maria, announced the Global Commission on People-Centered Clean Energy Transition. Exactly. People-centered, which I really like that word. I don't like the word transition as much, although we use it in this company because we know what it means. Only because, frankly, people have enough transition going on in their lives. There is just with the pandemic, with the global downturn, nobody wants to hear about any more change. But that change is real. And how we handle that and how we make sure everybody is included in that is very, very important. And it is a big challenge for governments all over the world. When I sit with my colleagues here in this space, when I became Natural Resources Minister, my predecessors told me, "Oh, Seamus, you're going to have to get used now to traveling all over the world to Indonesia, to Abu Dhabi, to Paris, and I've attended all these conferences from right here in St. John's, Newfoundland. But all world leaders, energy ministers from all over the world are grappling with the same thing. I mean, how do you get this right? And the coordination, I think, is the demand for coordination is very high, and governments are working together and they are coordinating. And the best example I can say of that is my weekly, if not more, phone calls with energy ministers across the country, most particularly the energy minister of Alberta, Sonia Savage. These are very important calls, and it's kind of almost above politics. It's so important that we get this right. In Canada's case, this is what we do. Natural resources is our economy. It's the backbone of our economy. Even with clean tech, oil and gas provides 80%, 70 to 80% of the investment in clean tech in this country. We have a responsibility to get this right. But I'm always heartened when I hear people from outside the country talk about our potential. So we just got to match that with ambition.
The point is, when everybody's talking about energy transition and we are concerned about the climate, but in the end, I think you're completely right. It's always about people, because what we are facing now, it's not just an energy transition, it's an economic and a societal transition, which also needs societal innovation. And that's an aspect that's not always on everybody's radar, but I think it's extremely important, because it's the only way to get the support of people, because it's also about people's behavior that has to change. And if you don't put your people in the center of your approach, then it won't work.
You will lose them. I could not agree more.
Yeah, it's going to be a tricky transition. So just to wrap up, at the beginning of this session, we learned that 44% of the people on the call were believing that we are very likely to go to net zero. So we have a lot of work to do to convince the folks on this call, at least, that this is an achievable goal. I think we gave them a lot of information today about the fact that things like $170 carbon tax can actually help us get there. That we did the elephant in the room, Minister Regan talking about KXL. It was disappointing, but let's hope that we can move aggressively towards this low carbon world and get rid of these perceptions that actually are quite dated. I think the perceptions that ended up at the cancellation of the KXL are based on what we were 10 years ago. And we have to move aggressively to show the world that we're not what we were 10 years ago, and we're aggressively going towards net zero. There's a role for natural gas. There's a great new opportunity emerging for hydrogen, and maybe can help create jobs, as Maria said, and bring the people along, especially in our oil and gas industry, because we have a huge opportunity there, and carbon capture and storage as well. We didn't really talk about that, but that's got to be a big part of the solution and a huge opportunity for Canada.
Jackie, I would just add one piece of trivia that could be very important. The future energy secretary in the United States, who we expect to be confirmed, is half Newfoundlander. And that means that I think Jennifer Granholm could be just a very practical person to deal with.
Yeah, so we'll look forward to collaboration with the United States, our closest trading partner. With that, we can just keep talking. This has been a fascinating conversation, but unfortunately we're out of time. So I must turn the call back to Chancellor Yedlin to close up the call. Or Yedlin, sorry. Chancellor Yedlin.
Chancellor, your terrier made a debut earlier, and he or she looks very happy.
She's a 13-year-old terrier. So yeah, in fact, she's still walking is a good thing. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, everyone, for being with us today. Maria van der Hoeven, Tengu Tofik, and thank you, Minister O'Regan. This is a very timely event, because net zero has vaulted to the forefront of policymakers, of business, of capital markets. This is something that we have to address in very short order. And I want to thank everybody for being so succinct and so thoughtful in their comments and giving us something to think about as we leave today. I want to thank PETRONAS Canada for sponsoring this event. A big thank you to Lasha Hash and the team at the Haskayne School of Business for making this event happen virtually this year. And we hope to see you next year at the PETRONAS International Energy Speaker Series in person, where we will have another speaker and another panel discussion to bring an international perspective on energy issues to Calgary. So thank you very much for joining us. There will be a feedback survey entered into the chat. If you have the time, please provide feedback to help us plan future events. Thanks again, and have a great afternoon.